The ranch on Willow Creek Road had always been quiet, until Marcus Hale moved in. To him, the 12 acres of Texas land were more than property. They were freedom. After 10 years of service in the U.S. Army, he wanted a place where he could breathe without hearing orders, alarms, or gunfire. A stretch of land where he could fix things with his hands instead of carrying a rifle. Marcus was the kind of man who spoke with actions. If a fence broke, he rebuilt it. If a horse limped, he stayed up all night nursing it. He didn't need an audience or anyone's approval. And that, ironically, was exactly what made his neighbors hate him. The Willow Creek Estates HOA had rules, ridiculous ones. The grass couldn't be over 3 inches. Mailboxes had to be white. All exterior lighting had to be warm tone. It was the kind of place where people cared more about curb appeal than compassion. Their queen bee was Linda Shaw, mid-50s. Tan from the HOA pool she called hers, and always armed with a clipboard. To Linda, Marcus's ranch was a personal insult. It sat right outside the HOA boundary, technically free from their control, but visible enough to ruin her perfect suburban aesthetic. She hated that his fences were wooden, that his barn wasn't painted beige, and that his porch light didn't match the others. Worse, Marcus didn't respond to her letters. He didn't wave when she drove by, and when she once complained that his horses smelled farmy, he just nodded and went back to cleaning their stalls. That silence drove her mad. So the HOA started small. They called the county about unlicensed livestock. They sent fake notices about environmental hazards. They even reported that his barn might contain illegal chemicals. Each time, the inspectors found nothing, but Linda wasn't the type to quit when the gossip got good. When Marcus got redeployed for 6 months, she saw her chance. With him overseas, the property looked still, quiet, unattended, exactly how she liked her opportunities. She convinced the HOA board that the ranch was abandoned, claimed it was dragging down property values. Then she filed bogus complaints and had a friendly property manager listed as available for foreclosure review. Of course, there was no foreclosure. Marcus's mortgage was automated. His taxes were paid. But paperwork, when passed through enough hands, can make lies look like facts. Within weeks, the land appeared on a private auction site. The HOA bought it through a shell LLC, then sold it to a developer at double the price. In 3 months, bulldozers came. The barn came down first. The oak trees followed. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, there was nothing left but concrete outlines for future luxury homes. When Marcus finally returned, jet-lagged and still in uniform, he drove down Willow Creek Road and didn't recognize his own land. The mailbox was gone. His horses were gone. His ranch, gone. He stood there for a long time, staring at what used to be his refuge, his small piece of peace. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. Linda smiled from her front porch, pretending not to notice him. Most men would have screamed. Some would have cried. Marcus didn't either. He just stood quietly, watching the wind push dust across his stolen land. The kind of silence that scares people, because it's the kind that comes before something massive. Marcus Hale wasn't just a soldier. He was a man trained to track, to plan, to recover. And while the HOA thought they'd buried him under paperwork and lies, they'd actually woken something they couldn't control. The next morning, he drove to base. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not yet. He just gathered every document, every payment confirmation, every record he'd ever kept. Years of service had taught him patience. Revenge, like a good operation, required precision. By the end of the week, he had a binder so thick it could stop a bullet. And that's when the real war began. Marcus didn't go to the local police. He knew how that would go. "It's a civil matter, sir." He didn't go to a lawyer either. He went to someone who had far more power, the Army Legal Affairs Office. It turns out, when you're an active-duty service member, your property is protected by federal law. The Service Members Civil Relief Act makes it a felony to sell or seize a soldier's property while they're deployed. And the moment the Army's legal team heard Marcus's story, they stopped treating it like a home dispute. They treated it like a crime. The investigation started quietly. Calls to the county clerk, requests for property records. Within days, they found forged documents, signatures that weren't his, approvals that didn't exist, and emails linking the HOA board to a real estate company known for shady, abandoned property sales. Linda had done it. And worse, she'd bragged about it. The Army's cyber division retrieved deleted emails from her HOA account, messages about cleaning up the eyesore, about making room for real neighbors. Every word dripped with entitlement, but Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. He'd learned long ago that victory doesn't start with noise. It starts with silence and precision. When the Army referred the case to the Department of Justice, things got serious. Subpoenas went out. Bank accounts were frozen. A quiet panic rippled through Willow Creek Estates. Linda's confident smile started to crack when federal agents showed up asking about misused funds and improper property transfers. And here's the best part. Marcus didn't have to lift a finger. The HOA board meetings turned from gossip sessions to shouting matches. Some members wanted to cut a deal. Others tried to delete evidence. But the digital trail was too long, too messy, and too obvious. The Army discovered that the HOA had used Marcus's land sale profits to cover their own debts, landscaping bills, pool repairs, even Linda's personal credit card. And because the money had crossed state lines through fake LLCs, it wasn't just fraud, it was racketeering. By month 3, half the HOA board had resigned. Their neighborhood Facebook group turned into a war zone of finger-pointing and panic. People started whispering about who might be next. And then, one morning, certified letters began landing in mailboxes all across Willow Creek Estates, official government seals. Legal wording, 4 simple lines that made homeowners drop their coffee cups. The property upon which your residence stands is subject to federal reclamation. Turns out, every one of those shiny new homes had been built on Marcus's stolen land. The Army wasn't just taking back his ranch. They were taking back every house that stood on it. Neighbors panicked. Some tried to call their lawyers. Others called Linda, who by then had gone mysteriously silent. Rumor had it she'd packed up and left town. And Marcus? He just watched it all unfold, quietly, from his truck at the end of the street, the same street that used to cut across his own front yard. He didn't gloat. He didn't wave. He just watched karma do what it does best. Work silently, but completely. And the funniest part? The Army wasn't done yet. By the time the sun rose over Willow Creek Estates that Monday morning, the neighborhood's group chat was already melting down. Half the residents hadn't slept. The other half were too busy pretending nothing was wrong. But the sealed letters had said it all. The land beneath their million-dollar homes wasn't theirs anymore. At first, people thought it had to be some clerical mistake. Maybe a typo, maybe a prank. But by noon, no one was laughing, because that's when the government SUVs rolled in, black, unmarked, and silent. Neighbors peeked through their blinds, clutching coffee mugs like shields. The sight was surreal. Federal inspectors walking house to house with clipboards, cameras, and legal documents. Every few minutes, they'd post a notice on a door. Property under federal investigation. Do not remove. It was the HOA's worst nightmare come true. And the funniest part? The HOA itself was gone. Their president, Linda Shaw, had vanished overnight. Her mailbox was empty, her driveway clear, and her house already up for sale. Apparently, she'd skipped town right before the subpoenas hit. The rest of the board had scattered, too. One moved to Arizona for health reasons. Another suddenly discovered a deep passion for international travel. But no amount of running could hide the paper trail. The Army's legal division had everything. Every forged signature, every backdated file, every dollar siphoned from Marcus Hale's stolen land. The residents, though, didn't care about the legal details. They cared about their homes, their investments, their lawns and driveways, all built on property that didn't legally exist anymore. At first, they were angry at Marcus, as if he was the problem, as if he had somehow tricked them. But the Army didn't play favorites. Facts were facts, and documents didn't lie. By Wednesday, a full federal team had set up command tents on the edge of the subdivision, the same patch of dirt that used to be Marcus's front field. Satellite dishes, drones, surveyors, the whole show. What once looked like suburbia now looked like a military operation. The irony was delicious. People tried to call the media, but every local outlet already had the story. Army sergeant's property stolen by HOA, entire neighborhood under federal seizure. The headlines spread like wildfire. By the next day, Willow Creek Estates had reporters parked outside its gates. The homeowners, once so proud of their gated privacy, now had cameras zooming in on their shocked faces. Neighbors who used to brag about property values were now covering the HOA logos on their mailboxes with duct tape. Meanwhile, Marcus watched from a distance. He wasn't smug, exactly, but there was a calm satisfaction in seeing the same people who once complained about his barn now scrambling to save their own houses. He hadn't asked for this level of chaos. All he'd wanted was his land back, but the Army had made it clear, once a fraudulent transaction touches federal protection laws, they don't just undo one sale. They unwind everything. Every permit, every construction approval, every mortgage tied to the stolen parcel. It was all void. One woman fainted when she realized her dream home had been built on what used to be Marcus's horse pasture and was now classified as illegal construction. Another homeowner tried to argue that they were innocent buyers, but that didn't matter. The law doesn't care about ignorance when the paperwork is rotten at the core. The developers, of course, were furious. They tried to shift blame to the HOA, saying they were misled. But their own emails betrayed them. Messages about fast-tracking, the ranch deal, and not worrying about the soldiers' return, Marcus had copies of everything. By the weekend, the first eviction notices went up. Not instantly forced but official. The process had begun. The Army wasn't cruel. They gave families time to move, but once the properties were cleared, they'd all be demolished. 12 homes in total, all built illegally, all on land that belonged by law to one man, and that man had kept every receipt. The sheer poetic justice was impossible to ignore. For years, Marcus had been treated like the outsider, the eyesore, the man who didn't belong in their pristine world of HOA perfection. Now those same people were packing boxes, calling movers, begging lawyers to do something. The same neighbors who once sent him HOA letters were now receiving government ones, with words like forfeiture, seizure, and federal order. And Marcus, he didn't need to say a word. His silence said everything. Still, he wasn't heartless. He felt sorry for the few who hadn't been involved, the retirees who'd just wanted a quiet life, the families who'd bought their homes in good faith. But deep down, he knew what his father used to say was true. When you build on stolen ground, don't expect the walls to stand forever. The funniest moment came the following Monday, when a new family, unaware of the drama, showed up with a moving truck, ready to move into a recently listed home. They didn't even make it past the gate before the guard stopped them. The wife held up her keys, confused. The guard pointed to the notice taped on the wall. She read it, then shouted back at her husband, "Honey, this says federal seizure." What does that mean? It meant the same thing it always did in Willow Creek now. The HOA had destroyed everything it touched. Within 2 weeks, the once flawless neighborhood looked like a ghost town. Lawns overgrown, houses empty, for sale signs ripped out. The pool, the one Linda used to brag about cleaning personally, had turned murky green. It was poetic decay. The media kept coming, but the novelty faded. What remained was silence, the eerie kind that used to exist before the HOA came to power. The sound of wind through empty yards, the sound of justice settling in. Marcus didn't rush to rebuild. He wasn't sure if he even wanted to live there again. He'd lost faith in the idea of homeowners associations. What kind of association destroys a man's home while he's serving his country? Still, he knew one thing. He wouldn't let anyone else decide what that land meant. Not the HOA, not the developers, not anyone. So as federal contractors began tearing down the abandoned homes, Marcus stood at the edge of the property with his hands in his pockets, watching. It wasn't triumph, he felt. It was peace. Quiet. Powerful, overdue peace. And somewhere out there, Linda Shaw, the woman who'd started it all, watched the news coverage and realized something chilling. She hadn't just stolen from a soldier. She'd declared war on the United States government, and the Army doesn't lose wars. By the time the last moving truck rumbled out of Willow Creek Estates, the neighborhood wasn't a neighborhood anymore. It was a cautionary tale, a quiet graveyard of dream homes built on lies. The once pristine lawns were now dotted with orange cones, survey markers, and warning tape. Everywhere you looked, there were reminders of how quickly power can rot. The HOA that once ruled every mailbox and flower bed had disappeared without a trace. The fancy "Welcome to Willow Creek" sign was gone. The community bulletin board, the same one that once displayed HOA fines and approved shrub lists, now flapped empty in the wind, its glass cover cracked and swinging open. All the board members had scattered like frightened birds. The vice president moved to Florida, claiming stress. The treasurer filed for bankruptcy. The secretary deleted her social media and vanished. And Linda Shaw, the self-proclaimed Queen of Willow Creek, was now the subject of an FBI warrant. It turned out her little project with Marcus's ranch wasn't her first scheme. She'd been rerouting HOA funds for years, landscaping contracts, community repairs, annual maintenance. Half of it was fake. The HOA wasn't just corrupt, it had been her personal ATM. When the investigation wrapped up, the total amount stolen was staggering, nearly $1.2 million, all siphoned from homeowners who never noticed because their lawns looked nice and their mailboxes matched. The neighborhood news cycle called her the HOA embezzler, and though she was nowhere to be found, her reputation spread across every HOA forum online. Screenshots of her old meeting notes became memes. People joked about pulling a Linda whenever an HOA president got too confident. But Marcus wasn't laughing. For him, the silence after the chaos felt heavy. He'd won, in every sense of the word. The law had sided with him, justice had been served, and the very people who'd mocked him were gone. But victory, he realized, doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it just feels quiet. The Army lawyers told him the land would revert back to his ownership once the legal reclamation was finalized. That meant he'd soon have the full 12 acres again, minus a few demolished houses and a pile of broken fences. When he finally stepped back onto the soil that used to be his ranch, he could still see faint outlines of where the HOA homes once stood. Concrete driveways, bits of tile, half-buried mailboxes, a ghost suburb sitting awkwardly on what had once been his sanctuary. But something about it made him smile. Maybe it was poetic. Maybe it was absurd. Either way, the irony was too perfect. This land had started as a peaceful ranch, turned into a monument of greed, and was now returning to its original owner, scarred but standing. That night, as the sun went down, Marcus parked his old truck in the same spot where his barn used to be. The air smelled faintly of dust and engine oil, but for the first time in years, it also smelled like freedom again. And then came the letter, a thick envelope from the Department of Defense. Inside, confirmation of full property restoration and compensation for damages, including the cost of the demolished barn, the destroyed fences, and even the loss of his rescued horses. The total figure was enough to rebuild 10 barns if he wanted. The government didn't just return what was his. They made sure he had the means to protect it forever. Word spread fast. Former HOA residents started posting apologies online. Some even tried to justify their involvement, claiming they didn't know what was happening. But internet justice is merciless. Every old Facebook post, every photo from HOA events, every smug comment about that rancher resurfaced. People who once paraded around in golf carts now hid from reporters. The community that once prided itself on perfection became a running joke on social media, the neighborhood that got evicted by the Army. Late-night talk shows mentioned it. Meme pages had a field day. Even the local news anchors couldn't hide their smirks while reporting on it. But Marcus stayed quiet. He wasn't the type to gloat. He'd learned something deeper through it all, that revenge, when served by karma, doesn't need a loud victory lap. He used the settlement funds to rebuild the ranch, not the way it used to be, but better. He hired veterans from his old unit to help clear the land and rebuild the barn. Together, they planted new trees, installed solar panels, and built a small rescue shelter for abandoned horses. Slowly, life returned. The soil, once disturbed by greed, began to breathe again. The new barn smelled of pine wood and hay. The wind carried the sound of hammering and laughter instead of HOA gossip. And that was when something unexpected happened. One morning, Marcus found an envelope taped to his new gate. No name, no return address. Just 3 words written in shaky handwriting. "I'm sorry, Linda." Inside was a cashier's check, $5,000. A small, almost pitiful amount compared to the damage she'd caused. But somehow Marcus didn't feel anger, just an odd, quiet closure. Maybe guilt had finally caught up to her. Maybe she'd realized that controlling a neighborhood wasn't power. It was poison. He didn't cash the check. He donated it to a veterans' housing charity instead. As the months passed, the land began to heal. Grass grew where driveways once were. Wildflowers sprouted through cracks in old concrete. Nature, it seemed, had a way of reclaiming what people ruined. By spring, the ranch looked alive again, a strange blend of past and present. A place that carried scars but stood proudly anyway. Sometimes people stopped by, curious drivers who'd heard the viral story, journalists hoping for a quote, but Marcus never said much. He'd nod politely, thank them, and go back to work. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in peace. And slowly, that peace returned. It came in small ways, in the sound of horses grazing, in the quiet hum of wind through the fence line, in the knowledge that justice, even when delayed, still works. The HOA had been erased, not just legally but symbolically. No one dared rebuild there again. The land that once hosted fake smiles and HOA rules now belonged solely to the man they'd tried to erase. It was more than justice. It was balance. Because sometimes the universe doesn't need permission to fix what people break. Sometimes it just waits for the right person to remind everyone what real ownership means. And Marcus Hale, the quiet soldier with the steel patience, had done exactly that. The HOA vanished overnight. The land endured, and in the end, the man they underestimated built something far stronger than a house. He built peace, and no HOA could ever take that away. When spring rolled across Willow Creek Road again, the land didn't look cursed anymore. It looked redeemed. From a distance, you could barely tell a neighborhood had ever existed there. The cracked driveways had been ground back into soil. The street lamps that once lit up gossiping neighbors now stood in a scrap pile behind Marcus Hale's new barn. Even the wind felt cleaner, like it had finally blown out years of arrogance and HOA perfume. Marcus rebuilt slowly. He wasn't chasing speed. He was chasing purpose. The new ranch rose out of the ashes, one board at a time, the kind of rebuild that tells a story without saying a word. He'd traded the old paint-peeled barn for a wide steel-framed structure with a blue tin roof that glimmered under the Texas sun. The veterans he'd hired, friends from deployments, men and women who knew how to rebuild from nothing, worked with an easy rhythm. Hammers, laughter, country music from an old radio. For the first time in years, the sound of hard work replaced the HOA's favorite soundtrack, complaints. The locals began calling it Redemption Ranch. Marcus never chose that name, but it stuck. Word spread that a soldier had taken back what was his and turned it into something bigger. Soon volunteers started showing up. A retired carpenter offered to build new stalls. A teenager from town brought rescued dogs. A rancher from 2 counties over donated hay. The land that had once been a symbol of greed was now a refuge. Marcus turned the extra acreage into an animal rescue program for veterans struggling with PTSD. Horses that had been abandoned found new caretakers. Soldiers who felt forgotten found something steady to hold on to again. The connection was simple but powerful. Saving something broken helped them save themselves. Every morning, Marcus watched the sun rise from his porch, the same direction where bulldozers once stood. Now there were horses grazing, dogs chasing each other, and wildflowers spilling across the fields. He didn't have to say it aloud. But everyone who visited could feel it. The land had forgiven the chaos. Still, reminders of the old HOA lingered in strange ways. One day, while clearing a pile of debris, Marcus's crew dug up a perfectly preserved HOA rules and regulations sign, the metal still shiny. Someone had probably buried it during the demolition, maybe out of spite, maybe out of habit. Marcus propped it against the barn wall as a joke. Visitors loved it. It became an unofficial monument, the tombstone of control. People laughed when they saw it, but Marcus saw something deeper. It reminded him how power, when misused, always ends up buried. Ironically, the HOA's legacy didn't just die quietly, it became internet folklore. You couldn't scroll through Reddit or TikTok without seeing clips about the neighborhood the Army took back. Animated storytellers, meme pages, even real estate podcasts discussed it. Imagine losing your house because you annoyed the U.S. Army, one viral caption read. Serves Karen right, another added. The story had everything: pettiness, justice, karma, and a soldier who didn't have to raise his voice once. Occasionally, Marcus would see his own face in thumbnail art online, sometimes drawn heroically, sometimes with exaggerated muscles, sometimes photoshopped in front of tanks. It made him laugh. The internet had turned him into a legend, but all he really wanted was to fix fences and feed horses. Still, there was something funny about the idea that the same HOA that once demanded uniform lawn colors was now trending under Dr. Uniform Justice. Months passed, and the seasons shifted again. The rescued horses flourished. The veterans who volunteered began calling the ranch home, even if temporarily. The land healed faster than anyone expected. Then, one late summer evening, the wind carried something unexpected, a sound Marcus hadn't heard in a long time: laughter from across the road. New neighbors had moved into the properties that bordered his ranch. Not an HOA, just regular folks who liked open skies. They waved when they passed. Some even offered to help with feed runs. The difference was night and day. No one cared if the fence was uneven or if the porch light wasn't regulation wattage. It felt human again. But the true full-circle moment came in the mail. A thick white envelope arrived from the county clerk's office. Inside was a certificate bearing an official seal. Property of Marcus A. Hale, reinstated and protected under federal registry. It wasn't just land now. It was legacy. Untouchable. Marcus framed it and hung it inside the barn office, right next to a faded photograph of his old squad from deployment. 2 battles, 2 victories, one overseas, one at home. Funny how wars don't always look like wars. Sometimes they look like paperwork and patience. He poured a cup of coffee and walked out to the fence line, staring across the fields as the sun dipped behind the horizon. The land looked endless again, the way it did when he first bought it. For a moment, he imagined what Linda Shaw would think if she saw it now. Her eyesore transformed into a sanctuary. Somewhere out there, she was probably scrolling through news headlines, seeing her name attached to the phrase federal indictment. Maybe she was regretting it. Maybe she wasn't. It didn't matter anymore. The land was back where it belonged. Every time a horse neighed or a hammer struck wood, it echoed the same quiet message. You can't steal peace and expect it to stay stolen. Reporters still called sometimes, hoping for interviews. Marcus always declined. His story had already been told thousands of times by strangers online. He didn't need to retell it. The land spoke for him now. What no one realized was that Marcus had a plan bigger than rebuilding. He wanted to ensure no veteran ever faced what he did. He started a non-profit, quietly, without press releases, called Operation Homefront Ground. Its mission was simple: provide legal aid and property protection for deployed service members. Within 6 months, donations poured in from across the country. Some came with notes like, "For every HOA that forgot who pays for their freedom." And that's how a small ranch in Texas became a movement. Not through anger, but through purpose. not through revenge, but through repair. Even local schools began visiting the ranch for field trips. Kids fed the horses, painted the old barn wall with murals of flags and sunsets. Parents told their children the story of the soldier who took back his land. For Marcus, it wasn't fame, it was fulfillment. Sometimes, late at night, he'd sit on the porch with a mug of coffee and watch the stars. He'd think about how strange it was that everything started with a mailbox complaint. That one petty letter could unravel an entire empire of control. But that's how life works. Tiny cracks split the largest walls. As the crickets hummed and the ranch lights flickered softly, he smiled. The HOA had wanted uniformity. What they got instead was history. And in that quiet, Marcus realized something he'd known deep down all along. Winning wasn't about getting even. It was about building something that couldn't be destroyed by small minds and smaller hearts. The HOA was gone. The land was alive, and the man they tried to erase had written his name into the soil permanently. By the time autumn rolled around, Redemption Ranch had become something more than a property. It was a statement. A quiet, sprawling, undeniable statement that said, you can't sell what you don't own, and you can't break what refuses to stay broken. The air carried that kind of peace only earned through chaos. Leaves fell in soft spirals across the fences. Horses exhaled foggy breaths in the early morning, and the rebuilt barn gleamed like a medal pinned on the heart of Texas. Marcus Hale had finally found silence, the good kind. The kind that didn't mean absence but presence. Presence of stability, of laughter, of redemption. The volunteers had become family. Veterans, teens, even retirees, people who needed something to believe in. Every face that showed up seemed to carry the same unspoken look. If he could get through that, maybe I can too. But life had one more surprise in store. It came in the form of a white envelope. No, not the kind filled with HOA threats or fines. This one was official, stamped, and hand-delivered. Marcus opened it slowly, half expecting another bureaucratic twist. Inside was a letter from the Department of Justice. It started simply, Dear Mr. Hale, we are writing to inform you that your case has been officially closed. The court has ruled all actions taken by the Willow Creek Homeowners Association to be unlawful. You are the sole and permanent owner of your property and all associated titles. In addition, proceeds from the federal asset liquidation of the HOA board have been distributed to you as reparations. Thank you for your service and for reminding this nation that justice is not a concept, it's a choice. Marcus blinked. Reparations. He turned the page. There it was, an attached document listing a dollar amount. It wasn't small. In fact, it was life-changing. The very money Linda Shaw and her board had built their empire on had now come full circle. The irony was delicious. Somewhere in a sterile courtroom, all the HOA's designer furniture, real estate investments, and trust funds had been sold off, brick by brick, to compensate the man they'd tried to erase. It was poetic justice with a financial bonus. Marcus didn't laugh out loud, but the smirk on his face said everything. He used the money exactly how no one expected. Not on himself, not on cars, not on revenge trophies. He used it to expand the ranch. A new facility for therapy animals, a small dorm for veterans who needed a place to stay, even a classroom for kids whose parents served overseas. He called it the Honor Barn. The old HOA office had been demolished long ago, but Marcus had saved one single brick from it, a cracked, faded thing. He placed it in the foundation of the new barn, right near the entrance, a symbol, a reminder of what not to build power upon. By winter, Redemption Ranch had become a thriving community hub. News outlets showed up, cameras rolled, headlines spun, but Marcus still refused every interview request. He didn't want to be a face on the news. He wanted to be the guy holding a shovel, quietly doing the work. Still, the legend kept growing online. The story had become folklore now, told in podcasts, narrated in viral videos, even animated in short clips. People loved the twist, the HOA that overreached and ended up destroyed by the same system they thought they controlled. Marcus sometimes scrolled through those videos late at night. They made him laugh, not because of how dramatic they were, but because every retelling missed one important detail. The real victory wasn't that he got his land back. It was that the land was free of bitterness. He'd forgiven them, every last one of them. Not because they deserved it, but because he refused to live in their shadow any longer. Still, one part of the story hadn't completely closed. A few weeks after the DOJ letter, another envelope arrived. This one wasn't stamped officially. It looked older, more fragile. The return address read, L. Shaw, Parole Facility, Austin. Marcus hesitated. Then he opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. Marcus, you probably don't want to hear from me. I don't blame you, but I needed to say this. I didn't understand what I was doing back then. I thought order meant control, and I confused both with power. I see now what I helped destroy, not just land, but people. I know I can't undo it, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry. You built something beautiful from what I ruined. I hope you find peace. Linda Shaw. Marcus folded the letter and set it on his desk. For a long time, he didn't move. There was no satisfaction in her apology, no victory lap. Just a quiet truth. Even people who did terrible things sometimes realized it too late. He didn't reply, but he didn't throw it away either. He placed it inside a small wooden box labeled Before. Inside were fragments of the past, old land deeds, photos, the first HOA violation notice. Artifacts of a war that no one else would ever fight again. The next morning, Marcus rode his horse to the far end of the property, where the grass grew tall and the view stretched endlessly. He watched the sun rise, golden and slow, across land that finally belonged to peace. The sound of hooves, the smell of fresh hay, the chatter of volunteers in the distance, it all blended into something whole again. He thought about all the people who'd passed through the ranch since that first day he took it back. The veterans who'd healed here, the teenagers who'd learned about compassion, the families who came to reconnect. The ranch had become a circle. Every kindness poured back into the soil, every scar turned into a seed. Later that evening, he locked the barn and walked to his porch. The same porch where he once received those HOA letters. But tonight, the mailbox sat still, peaceful, untouched. No threats, no fines, no HOA. Just silence and a sunset too beautiful to describe. He leaned back in his chair and smiled. The fight was over. Not because he won, but because he didn't have to fight anymore. Sometimes justice doesn't look like revenge. It looks like rest. As night fell, the ranch lights blinked on one by one, glowing softly against the dark. Somewhere, a veteran laughed. A horse neighed. Life continued, beautifully ordinary. Marcus closed his eyes and whispered to himself, home again. And for the first time in years, that word, home, didn't sound like a place he had to defend. It sounded like peace he'd finally earned, because in the end, the HOA didn't just lose a neighborhood. They lost the illusion of power. And Marcus Hale? He gained everything they could never buy, respect, redemption, and the kind of freedom that doesn't need a deed, and that's how the HOA learned. You can sell land, but you can't steal justice. The Army didn't just take back one ranch. They took back the whole neighborhood. This was HOA Story Files, where we expose the wildest neighborhood dramas, the craziest Karens, and stories that prove one thing. Karma always has perfect attendance. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe for more HOA chaos, and remember, you can't outvote justice.